Chapter 33: The Building of Global Empires. Throughout history, larger and stronger societies sought to dominate neighboring societies through imperial rule for control over natural resources, to eliminate threats, gain wealth, territory, and glory. During the second half of the 19th century, as the Ottoman and Qing empires weakened, Western European states began to impose imperialism. Factors including technological improvements in communication, war, and transportation allowed Europeans to impose hegemony throughout the world. Near the end of the century, the US and Japan joined European states as new imperial powers. Imperialism encouraged trade overseas between dominant states and their overseas colonies. Although campaigns to conquer foreign lands is expensive and dangerous, Europe was mostly successful due to their increasingly sophisticated technologies. Domination often arose from trade, investment, and business activities, allowing imperial powers to indirectly profit from and influence affairs of subject societies. European agents, officials, and business people effectively turned those lands into colonies and profoundly influenced their historical development by controlling domestic and foreign policies, integrating local economies into the network of global capitalism, introducing European business techniques, transforming education, and promoting European culture. It was pointed out by advocates that overseas colonies could serve as reliable sources for raw materials not available in Europe, such as rubber, tin, and copper. Even if colonies were not economically beneficial, they were seen as crucial for political and military reasons. Some occupied strategic sites on the world's sea lanes, and others offered harbors or supply stations for commercial and naval ships. Imperialism was also observed as a great alternative to civil war by Cecil Rhodes. Culturally, spiritual campaigns by European missionaries provided a powerful religious justification for imperialism. Other Europeans wanted to civilize in the form of political and or social stability. The mission Civilistrice was used as a justification for expansion into Africa and Asia, and was defined as the white man's burden. Without powerful technological advantages, imperialists wouldn't have been able to impose their rule. Transportation-wise, innovations included steamships and railroads, as well as the Suez Canal and Panama Canal. As for military technologies, European armies were using breech-loading firearms with rifled bores, which were more accurate and reliable than muskets. By the 1870s, Europeans were experimenting with machine guns, and communication technologies also became more efficient with the use of the steamboat and telegraph.
In the later half of the 19th century, Europe had regained interest of colonialism in the regions of Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. This wave of empire building was sparked by British involvement in the colony of India. The British Empire used the English East India Company to grow its influence in South Asia. The East India Company actually started by building fortified ports along the Indian coastline with permission from the Mughal Emperor. After the Mughal Emperor's death, the East India Company took that opportunity to expand their territories. By the 1750s, the East India Company had launched conquest campaigns across India backed by a small British army. The company's reign ended when the sepoys of the army revolted and the British Empire assumed control over the colony. And in 1858, Queen Victoria decided that India would be ruled by a Secretary of the State for India. The British rule of India resulted in the clearing of forests for lumber, the increased cultivation of tea, coffee, opium, and for use and trade. The British Empire also connected India to the global economy through the establishment of railroads. The British also pushed its influence into the culture there by creating English-style schooling and changing the way they dressed to match that of what is seen in England. Several large British expansions increased their flow of raw materials and money, such as the establishment of the Burma colony and the port of Singapore by Thomas Stamford Raffles. While this occurred, Russia was trying to expand its empire into the Caucasus region by taking advantage of a weakening Ottoman and Qing presence. With the fight over Central Asia looming, British and Russian spies engaged in the Great Game, which was a war for intelligence in preparation for the perceived war to come for India. Luckily, there never was a war, but the two countries held their territories in Central Asia until the 20th century. In Southeast Asia, Europe also looked to establish a dominance over the region. The first example of this is the Spanish colonization of the Philippines to acquire its valuable cash crops. The British used Singapore to conquer Malaysia to get the large amounts of tin and rubber there. The French colonized Indochina to create a French culture in Southeast Asia. The French also set up European-style schools and popularized Catholicism in modern Vietnam. The scramble for Africa occurred from 1875 to 1900 in search for opportunity imperialism of the region. European adventurers would chart territories for countries to imperialize. Of these adventurers, there were Dr. David Livingstone, Henry Morton Stanley, Richard Morton, and John Speke. The role of Africa was characterized by brutality. The most apparent example of this was the Belgian rule of the Congo. The Congo was King Leopold III's personal colony, and he made the natives subject to inhumane treatments such as extensive labor and the removal of limbs. It is estimated that about 4 to 8 million Africans were killed because of colonial rule.
Before the 19th century scramble, the Dutch East India Company established Cape Town in 1652 as a supply station for ships en route to Asia. It gained newly arrived settlers from Europe called Boers, the Dutch word for farmer, and African people known as Afrikaners. Afrikaners were seen by Europeans as theirs to claim the resources of the Cape. Population expanded due to a stream of chiefly Dutch, Germans, and French fleeing religious persecution. The settlers had begun spreading beyond the original colony and infected the Khoikhoi and Xhosa peoples, which ultimately led to their death. The British takeover of the Cape during the Napoleonic Wars 1799 to 1815 encouraged further Afrikaner expansion into the interior of South Africa. Tensions between European colonies led to the Berlin West African Conference, which produced the agreement that any European state could establish African colonies after notifying others of their intentions. The earliest approach to colonial rule involved concessionary companies. European governments granted large amounts of land for economic activities such as mining, plantation, agriculture, or railroad construction. New imperial powers. The U.S. pushed indigenous peoples onto marginal lands and reservations. The U.S. wielded other European imperialist colonies by issuing a proclamation that prohibited other imperialist activities in the Western Hemisphere known as the Monroe Doctrine. In the late 19th century, the U.S. guaranteed free trade in the region. This benefited U.S. entrepreneurs and their European allies who brought natural resources and agricultural products of the Americas to the world market. In 1867, the U.S. purchased Alaska from Russia and in 1875 claimed a protectorate over Hawaii, which had sugarcane plantations. After the Spanish-Cuban-American War that took place in 1898 through 1899, U.S. took control and possession of Cuba and Puerto Rico, then defeated the Spanish fleet and took over Guam and the Philippines in a single day. The U.S. quickly established colonial government in most of its possessions. To prevent rebellion and protect American businesses, the U.S. intervened with Caribbean and Central American lands by having the military occupy Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, the Honduras, and Haiti.
In the 19th century, colonial conflict was not uncommon amongst subject people and colonizers, and most often led to violent interactions between the II. Efforts such as the Sepoy Rebellion were taken in order to resist British colonial authority amongst the subject people. Colonized lands in Southeast Asia and Africa also became known as the hotbeds of resistance as the subject people revolted against foreign rule. Angered by the behavior of colonial officials, the introduction of European schools, high taxation, and requirements that subject people also cultivate certain crops or provide labor for colonists. Many of these rebellions were driven by traditional religious beliefs, and usually priests or prophets often led the resistance to colonial rule. An example of this would be the Mahi Mahi Rebellion of 1905 that lasted through 1906. Rebels believed if they sprinkled themselves with magic water, aka the Mahi Mahi, they would be protected from German weapons. Yet it was ineffective, and as many as 75,000 insurgents died. Yet rebellion was always a constant threat to colonial rule. On many occasions, the subject people would not revolt and instead resisted the colonial rule by boycotting their goods and organizing political parties and pressure groups. They would also publish anti-colonial newspapers and magazines and even pursue anti-colonial policies through the churches and religious groups. Scientific racism also became popular within the 19th century after a French nobleman by the name of Joseph Gobineau influenced many to believe that race was now the new measure of human potential. Gobineau eventually went on to publish an essay on the inequality of human races and divided humanity into 4 main racial groups, which each had their own traits. He characterized Africans as unintelligent and lazy, the Asians as smart and docile, the native people of Americas as dull and arrogant, and the Europeans as intelligent, noble, and morally superior to the others. In the later 19th and early 20th centuries, racist thinkers began to identify racial groups on a basis of skin color, their bone structure, their nose shape, their cranial capacity, and other physical characteristics, and eventually agreed that Europeans were superior to the other people. These scientific races eventually applied Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest and adapted it to explain the development of human societies. Herbert Spencer, who was an English philosopher, relied on the theories of evolution to explain the differences between the strong and the weak, referring to successful individuals and races that had competed better in the natural world and evolved to higher states than others did. Spencer and others justified the domination of European imperialists over the subject people as a result of natural scientific principles. Colonial experience only reinforced popular racism and led many to assume that there was a moral superiority of Europeans over others. An example of this would be the treatment Filipinos received from the U.S., who referred to the Filipinos as goods and did not hesitate to torture them in a conflict, and was justified as an effort to civilize and Christianize the Filipinos from President McKinley. Imperialism and colonialism pushed and influenced subject people towards nationalism, especially in India. In the 19th century, elite Indians helped many of their fellows create a source of their own identity, and one of the most well-known is named Ram Mohan Roy, and he is known as the father of modern-day India. He wished to have an Indian society based on European science and traditional Hinduism, and utilized the press to educate fellow Hindus and advance the reform. The Indian National Congress was founded in 1885 and was created for educated Indians to meet to discuss public affairs with British approval. The Congress would discuss grievances about colonial rule such as British racism, trade and tariff policies, Indian poverty, and other things which would lead the Indians to fight for self-rule. In 1906, the Indian Muslim League was formed to advance the interests of Muslim Indians. Also in 1906, colonial authorities granted wealthy Indians the opportunity to elect representatives to local councils. Indian nationalism was a powerful movement, and they eventually gained independence in 1947. Many other nations and subject people looked up to them for their anti-colonial campaigns as well.